Ladies and gentlemen, we love that you are joining us here, and we hope that you could do us a favour. If you are liking our episodes, please share them. Tell us that you like them. Leave us a review, and we will be eternally grateful.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to The Wizard and the Priestess. I am your host, Nuala, and I am with my co-host,
Matt. Hi, Nuala.
Hi, Matthew. I see you're wearing yellow too.
Yeah, matching, just connected.
That's it. Read today that there's essentially a now that science has proven telepathy is real, it is real. That's pretty cool.
They've done many experiments on that. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Through meditation also.
Ah, yes. Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
I was going to say that we've just hit the juncture of the eclipse season beginning in the North Node, Virgo. The South Node of Virgo.
The beginning of the season?
Yeah, so there'll be this is the first eclipse in the South Node of Virgo, or within the nodes of Virgo Pisces. And so this will be I actually learned this. The South Node is in Virgo, so we've had that full moon and full eclipse that happened on Friday.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next there'll be another partial eclipse that occurs in a few weeks on the new moon, which will be a partial eclipse in the sun of Pisces.
So what does everyone have to do to balance their energy out for that?
Well, everyone's different because your astrology natal chart is going to be placed down onto the your astrology. Oh, there's someone. Hang on a second. There's someone at the door. Is there? Have we got a guest?
There is. Yeah.
Oh, then hang on. Wait. Let's just wait. Sorry. Let's just let them sit there for a moment at the door, or should we let them in? Hang on.
What you want.
We're going to leave them at the door for a minute and just say, that's pretty cool that we have a guest coming on our show today.
We do. Who is it, Noah?
So our guest, actually, she could probably talk me in circles around astrology. Her name is Morgan Azali, and she is essentially she is a writer, a poet. She is a witch in the most beautiful terms. She is a plant medicine artist. She's all the things that essentially that encompasses all things feminine and womanhood and alchemist, all those things. So
we should stop being rude and just let her in.
Should we let her in?
We should.
All right. We can let her in. She's getting set up.
Technology. We'll have to entertain the people in the meantime. I could tell a joke.
Oh, yes. Go with our joke.
So,
Dad joke of the week, Matt.
What is the best present that you could give someone?
Fucking stupid. Love.
A broken drum. Can't beat that.
Dun dun. Wow.
Welcome, Morgan. I'm sorry you had to hear that for the first time.
I have no idea what was going on there. I didn't catch any of it.
Perfect. Nuala likes my jokes.
So we've started the show with a few of Matt's dad jokes just to spruce it up a little bit.
Perfect.
Spruce up the show. I was just talking about or touching on the eclipse, and that I had learnt that I'd only learnt this week, that when it's whatever the eclipse season is, it's always every cycle of eclipse season always correlates to the nodes that have been what are they called? Activated for the year or for the 18 months. And then I said, and then we had a knock on the door. Did we? We had a guest at the door.
That's
and lo and behold, Morgan Azali is in the house.
Boom. Intro music.
Dun, 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 dun.
She's already practiced that.
On the spot. Yes,
Do you want
the nodes.
Well, Morgan, can you tell us a little bit about who you are? Just a little bit, please.
Sure.
I'll just say that I did do that, but
So ignoring Nula, I'd like to hear from Morgan now.
I'm putting my baby to sleep and Nola's like, you've got 5 minutes. Come on now.
Welcome to my world, Morgan.
All right, let's go. I don't know. Have you done an introduction for me yet? I guess there's a few things going on in my world. I have completed an honours degree in depth psychology and been running an apothecary and ritual workshops with plant symbolism and earth energetics and all that sort of thing. So, yeah, dabbling in a few different realms.
So you're not
all
born.
connected, all basically working with the symbolic language and trying to help everyone to peer beyond the veil, I guess, and see that there is this magical undercurrent that we're all riding.
I remember Carl Jung saying, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, you'll continue to call it fate."
It will direct your life, and you
Yeah.
will call it fate. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's
Yeah.
pretty evident in the world today.
Yeah. Well, everyone's afraid to look at the shadow, aren't they? Nobody wants to touch the thing that is hiding, and I mean, it's valid because it's there in the shadows for a reason. Reason
So Morgan,
being,
if you had a definition of shadow, what's your personal definition?
well, the shadow is something that you've hidden from your consciousness. So it's something that you have probably unintentionally decided not to accept as part of your being, or maybe it was something that just came through your lineage and it's just like hidden from you for whatever reason, like your ancestral memory of something that at one point in time felt like a dangerous or socially unacceptable thing to be or trait to have, and so you pushed it aside and pretended that it wasn't a part of you. So then that shadow ideally then is something that actually holds a key to your authenticity. So the whole goal of alchemy, which I work a lot with, is to face that shadow and work and see what's under it, and by getting to the bottom of it, it's where your actual gold lies, your soul.
Yeah. Have you studied much of Joseph Campbell?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah. So he says I'm going to paraphrase the shit out of this. It's the cave you fear most, or something.
Holds the treasure that you seek.
Boom. That's the one. Yeah.
The cave
How
you
good
fear
is
to
this?
enter.
Yeah. This time of night,
and that's exactly it.
Yeah. This time of night, my quote recollection is really good, as you can tell.
I gotcha.
Yeah.
Morgan has come with the goods.
I know. I've got it. Yeah, I think I don't know, it's really powerful, and I've experienced myself just the value of it, because it's always there, and it's always, as we said before, like it's directing your life. It's the stuff that happens to you, and you can see it as something that is negatively acting upon you, or you can recognize that it's part of your projection. And projection being, you've built this narrative around it and decided to place it outside of yourself because you're unwilling to accept it as part of you. So by facing the shadow, you realize that you had a role in the creation of your destiny, and you are telling the story. I feel like the biggest thing with all of it is that it's like the world is a narrative, the world is a story, and the shadow is a story, and that's all it. Like once you realize that that's all it is, it loses its power. It's like if you realize that the reason that you are hiding one aspect of yourself because a 5-year-old version of you felt like it was, I don't know, making them a victim or potential victim in some way by exhibiting that trait, you'd put it inside of you and not let it come out. And then so if you can uncover that shadow and then go through that inner child work and be like, oh, I can see how it's not that this is actually a bad thing to be. It's just that I created this story around it at that time. Then it loses its power and you can realize that your true self is under there just waiting to come back through.
And what would you say, Morgan, to people who just basically split things into good and bad or right and wrong, and integrating that into sort of shadow and light attributes?
Light and dark.
I would direct them to a famous philosophical story, which I can't remember in its full exactness, but the idea is it's only good or bad because we deem it so. So there's like a little story parable thing that I can't remember the origin of it, but it was like this man who his horse broke his leg or something, and everyone was like, oh, that's so bad. No, he broke his leg, and everyone was like, oh, that's so bad. And he was like, maybe. And then the next minute, everyone in the town got enlisted for war, but he couldn't go because he'd broken his leg. And so everyone's like, oh, you're so lucky. It's like, maybe. But then because he stayed back in the town, something supposedly bad happened, and it's like, yeah, maybe. Anyway, the moral of the whole story is that you don't know what's good or bad. Things just kind of happen and everything is neutral. And we tell our story, like the whole Christian story of the devil and God, and all of that just comes from the original church people saying that the pagan horned goddess and the nature rituals and worship were something that is bad, even though it was literally just people connecting to nature, and it was just something that was in opposition to what they were trying to bring through. So this narrative was created around it. And yeah, that duality, that polarity is what we kind of exist in this physical world, but the physical world is only one of the stories.
But if it goes against profit, it's very bad, of course. Terrible people.
For sure.
No, it's making people money.
Yeah. What would you say to somebody who is holding that dichotomy?
Well, I think it pretty much what you said, and it's also who's to say what good or bad is. We get our conception of good or bad from other people, and I've said this to Nuala at least 1,000 times. The words could, should, would are based on, if you do something, say something, think something. I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't have done that. Or I should do this. Whatever that story is, that's based on someone else's idea. So we're not really living our own lives if that's the story that we're telling ourselves. And good or bad is purely subjective. And as you were saying, it's not necessarily good or bad. It is what it is. It's up to us to make it good or bad. And it's going to be good or bad in relation to what we hold value to us as unique individuals, on our own belief system and our own, what we love and what we hold dear to ourselves. But a lot of people get so stuck in, I guess, their intellectual mind, they try to conceptualize something that needs to be experienced. And I think it was Carl Jung said that intellectualism is a common cover-up for direct experience. So how many people live their lives intellectualizing, trying to be a good boy or girl for mummy or daddy, be it religious or parental or something higher up, yet suppressing themselves, but believing they're doing the right thing or the good thing to be praised. And COVID was a great example of all that. And, they say the longest journey you'll ever make is, only a foot, but it's between your head and your heart.
Haven't heard that one before.
But then to the degree that we're intellectualizing everything and just trying to, because our conscious mind needs to put everything into a box so we can, I guess, grasp that, because what's beyond that transcends human thought, and ultimately we're conditioned to fear that. And then to the degree we fear that, we close ourselves down to it, not realizing that's actually the cave that we're kind of wanting to go in unconsciously.
Yeah. Well, that's all the shadow, isn't it? It's that story. It's literally just like the narrative that we've told ourselves and cast outside of us, when really it's something that has arisen from within, and it's all what you make it. And I think I've personally found as well that if you choose to see that things are working in your favor, then more often than not they are.
Well, 100%, but also giving yourself permission to live that and experience it is a whole other thing as well. But then also, if we're living our lives, we want to do that or say that or think that, but then our circle of friends or family or our little tribe that we've gathered, if what we think, do, or say goes against what that is, then we have to create another persona. And that persona is also the blueprint for another shadow as well. And Buddha calls that the cage of the five senses, which is the more characters we try to portray for different people, then the more shadows we're likely to essentially build. And then the more shadows we build, the more archetypes we have to play out. The more archetypes we have to play out, then it just leads to either mental illness, fatigue, burnout, and ultimately ending up in a pandemic if we're going into the collective.
I wanted to touch on before you dive, because Matt, you're diving and it's great. But I just want to say one thing, that in language, in certain languages, you know that should, could, and would don't exist. So I think in Japanese, it doesn't exist. And I remember hearing a story of a man talking about the war, and he was American Japanese by this stage, I think, and he was speaking with his grandfather, who was during the war, was essentially, they missed a certain experience, and then they ended up being in the war and having to go through it and traverse it, and ended up in Hawaii. And then he obviously whatever, but he was asking his grandfather in English, like should we have done it differently, or would it have been, would it have been different or something? And his grandfather's just like, that's just not an option. There is no would or should or could have anything. It is what it is. And I often find Peter Crone is one of these men that I've found along the way. And he specifically states, he lost his mum from cancer really young, and then he lost his dad on a work site injury. And so he literally went to work one day and never came home. So he literally was orphaned. It was like, maybe he was like 17 or 16, 17. He was orphaned. But realistically, he learned from that experience that everything happens just as it's meant to. There's no other way it could have gone, because it didn't. And that's all those pieces that you're both talking about in sense of bringing up that shadow, is like we have these exiled parts that either society, we've talked about this in recent times, but either society has pushed us away, we've naturally pushed them down, or we have been told to push them down so by our inner self, so that we can be a part of the tribe that we've decided we want to be a part of. But last week we dived into the archetypes, didn't we, Matt?
We did.
And we were, and then me and Morgan have been talking about this. And guys, if you've been listening to our episodes recently, I have touched on, or I've mentioned Morgana, and Morgana and Miraculina are really good friends. And as of the eclipse, we have both transformed into our alter egos. So please call me Miraculina from this day forth. And there is Morgana over there too. Anyway, as we move on, Morgana actually, how I brought this to Matt was, I said, Matt, Morgana is really interested and into sort of the dark feminine, and she dives into the archetypes in this way, or, she's learnt about all these things in from this perspective. And he was like, well, okay, we'll see how we go. But I think it'd be really interesting to hear. Matt, do you want to ask the question to Morgana about the particular direction you wanted to take this archetype chat?
Based on your facial expression, I feel like I'm getting set up here. but that's fine. It's not the first time, nor will it be the last. Something that Nuala said last week, she was saying that these archetypes don't sound like they're good. And I was trying to explain, clearly I failed, that archetypes aren't necessarily good or bad. They are what they are. We make them good, bad, whatever. So, Morgan, can you please do what I failed in?
Morgana.
Morgana.
And please explain to Miraculina.
Higher self only.
This is what my life has become.
Yeah,
Hang on,
well,
what was your
the
name?
archetypes.
Sorry?
Matt was meant to find a name.
Do you have a new
He didn't-
name, Matt?
He didn't figure out his higher self.
I didn't know I was doing
He'll be
that.
stuck here for the
It's
next
time to
18
come.
months.
All right, give me 5 minutes. You talk.
Yeah, well, the archetypes, Jung explains that they are basically representations that are pulled from like instincts. I can't remember if that's the exact way or if it's the instincts are related to the archetypes, but either way, they're interwoven. And it's basically just like the reason that they hold power and hold value is because they are coded into the basic instincts of our being. So way back from the times of our earliest ancestors, the kinds of lessons and roles that we fell into from the dawn of humanity. And so the reason that they hold resonance and the reason that they are valuable within any kind of framework today is because they're kind of rooted in those basic core DNA codes that we're structured on. So there's no good or bad in that. It's just that's like the human code.
What I wanted to say about that, I do understand that from a logical perspective, that there is, intellectually I can see, okay, they both have their positive and negative. However, when you look at something like, the wounded child or the saboteur or the prostitute, those words even themselves are not seen to be, whilst there are absolute function in positive ways, there is like the word themselves also already connotates like this sense of like, oh, society has already shunned that part,
That comes down to that whole narrative talk again, doesn't it? Because that definition is something that you personally have built up around it as well. Like, and it's something that maybe came after the archetype itself.
Absolutely. And I'm not denying that. I just find it really interesting. Like, obviously, logically and intellectually, I understand it. And I understand the way that my brain has been like, or society essentially has told me this is, to be a prostitute is not a good thing, essentially, or to be, obviously you exile the wounded child, because who wants to be playing out wounded childdom as an adult, whilst every person is doing so to some extent in certain aspects of their lives. So it is anyway, I digress. I would like you to dive into, so we've been talking about the dark feminine a lot, Morgana, and would you care to share for our audience more about the dark feminine?
Sure. Not knowing what's already been said, I'll try to build on it. Essentially, the dark feminine, the way that I see it and I work with it anyway, is that it is a part of the shadow, and it's that feminine part of the shadow. And so all of the things that we kind of code with the feminine being things like sexuality, sensuality, the rage and power that comes with the nurturing aspect of the mother, all of those things that are like strongly emotionally dominated or whatever, the things that we kind of think are not societally acceptable, we put into that dark feminine category. And so we've got all of these archetypes that reflect like the different ways that could show up. And so all of the different archetypes that we can use come from mythology, and they will all hold different aspects of it. Like Kali in the Hindu mythology, for example, has this rage, that tells the story of this untamed destruction that comes with this just completely unleashing that upon the world until she comes face to face with Shiva, and that divine masculine is able to hold her in a way that she's able to turn it into a loving expression of boundaries and strength. There is Lilith, who is, throwing back to the Christian talk from before, the first wife of Adam, who I think it was in Mesopotamian myth, was part of the story that everybody knew. She was created from clay, just like he was, but she didn't want to be made to be subordinate to Adam when the order came upon her to do so. So she sprouted wings and flew from the garden. And because she chose to be sovereign to someone who was her equal, she was cast out and vilified and turned into this demon, and then has been left out of the Christian retelling of that exact story. And so she's like the collective shadow of woman being in a state of wholeness, which is interesting, actually, throwing back to the beginning about the nodes. The Virgo is the archetype of the virgin originally meaning a woman who is whole unto herself, not tied to any man or in that like subordinated role. And then she's coming forth with this moon of dark feminine freedom. Basically just being like the true self, and again that treasure that's inside the cave or the shadow.
So the privilege
Magic.
of a lifetime, as Joseph Campbell said, is really being yourself.
Totally. It's the only key.
Can I come back to Lilith, and can you explain, so was it Adam's had a wife, her name was Lilith, and then she was essentially exiled, and then he met Eve?
So Adam and Eve were the later invention of the couple. Eve was made from Adam's rib. So Lilith and Adam were both created from the clay. Lilith said, "Nuh-uh, I don't want to bow down to you. I'm leaving." So she left by herself. She wasn't exiled. She chose to leave. And then Adam was all by himself. So God was like, "Oh, poor Adam, I'll give him someone else to play with." And so he took one of his ribs and turned it into a new person. And so by nature, Eve was subordinate to him because she was from him. So I actually wrote a little bit about this in a blog post, my first ever Substack post a few days ago. But essentially, like, I was connecting that to the curiosity of what's outside the garden and why is this such a bad thing. And it's that state of chaos, and that's the state of recognizing that there isn't this stability that we like to comfort ourselves with. We live in this world that is perpetually open to change. It's the resonance of the fiery pits of hell. It's where Lilith sent herself to, and where Adam and Eve were sent to when Eve ate the fruit from the tree of knowledge, essentially gained insight into the truth of their nature. And so they were cast out into this state where they could then create a new earth and a new garden. And it's been cast as this bad thing, but it's actually the key to reality and the whole path of alchemy.
So are we on Earth?
Yeah, I guess. We're on a Earth.
Hang on. I meant to say,
Welcome
are we
world.
on their Earth?
We're on the illusion
Morgana.
of an Earth.
We're on the illusion of Earth, this plain rock in the metasphere. But are we on the Earth that they were essentially exiled to?
We're on the Earth that Eve was exiled to, yes.
Is that literally or symbolically?
And Adam. Literally, like in the telling of the Bible, I'm pretty sure. Don't come at me.
Let's just take it as that.
They were in the garden and they got kicked out of the garden. And so we're all called like the children of Eve or the daughters of Eve or whatever, because we are the race that arose from them being cast out of the garden and creating a new
And
world.
what happened to Lilith?
Lilith?
Did she come down? Lilith? Did she come down too?
Lilith, pretty sure she's like hanging out in the underworld eating children or something.
Bitch move.
They just like cut her out and said she's a demon.
Classic.
Yeah, okay. But then if they said that she's a demon and then we're now aware that she is like, that obviously is not true because there's no positive or negative.
Yeah.
So where could she actually be?
In the dark feminine shadow, of course.
So in other words, Lilith lives in everyone.
Lilith lives within you. And if you look at your astrology chart, you'll find out exactly where.
As does
You'll
I
Alchemist.
know.
have the black moon Lilith, which is essentially not even a space. It's the black moon, which is like a black hole, which is just like a void of space. But it has this gravitational force to it that is magnetic. And yeah, I feel a pretty strong resonance to all of that energy as it shows up in terms of just plugging into that. I don't know, I guess it is the dark feminine. It's that space within that has all of that suppressed feminine power. And I don't know if I feel it more because of my Lilith placement or because I'm a woman, but everyone has that shadow and that feminine archetype within them, man or woman. And Lilith holds a mirror to all of that because she was part of that creation story that was so deeply coded from very, 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 very early on.
So Morgan, would you say it's somewhat accurate to say then anyone who's feeling emotionally suppressed, is there somewhat activation of their inner Lilith, if that makes sense?
Can you rephrase that?
So if someone's emotionally suppressed, is that Lilith talking?
It's probably like their refusal to hear Lilith talking.
Okay, that makes so.
The rejection of that more than anything. Because once you start to plug into and allow her to speak, or any of that energy that is in that dark feminine archetypal zone to come through, it's activating, and it's like a Kundalini awakening. It feels like this energy that's flowing through you, and it's that like life-giving sensuality, and it's that, I don't know, that inner power. And so when you can listen to that, you wouldn't feel suppressed at all. You'd feel the opposite of suppressed.
So it's
But
Lilith wanting to talk, wanting to express itself.
Yeah. Well, there's always that dark feminine is always wanting to work through you. It's the Kundalini, really. It's that energy that this is the thing, like every society is basically saying the same thing in different ways. I think it was Ram Dass or someone who said everyone is God in drag, and it's the same kind of thing. Like everyone's got their own story, but it's all talking about that same thing. And it is that power within you.
Yeah. How magic is that? when you really you just bring it back in and everything is the same. Isn't that just the everything is the sun and the moon and the stars? All rotating in one as one. And what I wanted us to dive into now was this. We talked about this. Well, me and Matt were talking about last week the archetypes, and then like we'd been talking about the archetypes in terms of like you just mentioned Kali and the goddess or the dark shadow and all of those bits and pieces. And so I was interested to know about whether you had, whether you focused the archetypes the same way that that Matt has, or
no. So we spoke of Carol and Mrs. sort of organization of them being core archetypes, survival archetypes, and then like the active archetypal model. But that's just one of many models.
Yeah, so there's a few different ways that you can explore it. There are the more complex models, or you can come to the 4 main archetypes, which that's what I'm referring to when I talk about the shadow. It's one of those 4 key archetypes. So it's kind of a different, more concentrated method, but it includes the persona. Is it the persona? It's the self, the shadow, the anima or animus, and what did I say? Oh, it is the persona, the shadow, the anima, the animus, and the self. Yeah. So the shadow is one of those, and that is the part of us that holds that energy that is deemed socially unacceptable, which includes all of the dark feminine stuff sitting neatly tucked in there, as I see it.
And what would you define as the persona in that
Persona would be
concept?
like the personality.
Okay. Is that more ego?
Yeah. How do we represent? So the ego is the outward self. So that I'm not 100% sure whether that would be completely tied into the persona or the self, but either version of that, it's the part of the psyche that is conscious. And so it's the one that cages the shadow essentially as well. It's the center of the conscious awareness and the perception of the identity. It's basically how we see the world as a thing that we deem real or whatever. It's the eyes that we look through.
Yeah. Is in Jung's model, is the ego, I guess the mechanism, for lack of a better word, the part of us that I guess puts the shadow on the back shelf?
Yeah. So the ego is associated with the conscious self. I think ego might be Freudian. Do you know? I'm pretty sure that he had originally put in the ego and the superego and the id and all of those terms. And then Jung kind of created a slightly alternate model based on the same sorts of ideas. But yeah, that ego self, which it's so sad because that's another thing that has been kind of put into a shadow in a sense as well, because there's so much in the spiritual community talk about like burning the ego and getting rid of the ego. And one of the misconceptions of alchemy as well is the idea that you have to destroy the ego, and all of that is like completely disconnecting you from your reality and your state of expressing and interacting with the world, because that is the outward self. So all you want to do is be able to see that is an illusory construct built upon narrative and the first law of the Hermetic principles. I don't know if you've touched on that, but that is mentalism. And that comes back to that same idea that everything is just a product of the mind. And so the ego is that very soft, malleable frame that the shadow or subconscious sits in.
Yeah, I think the ego is, for me, it's a bit of a paradox because the ego gets a bit of a bad rap because anytime we go through something, let's call it bad, the ego cops it. And yet without the ego, we wouldn't be having the experience of the very thing. And I know Carl Jung said that religions are specifically designed to protect us against the direct experience of God. And from what I take from that personally is once you have a direct experience of God or the Imago Dei, you lose the ego. The ego is in nirvana, which means by definition burnt out. So therefore you lose every ideology, concept of who you are and everything that you know and love, because you become one with all that is. So therefore there's no more individuation. And that scares the shit out of the ego. So in other words, the ego has to make little illusions for its own self to be participatory in that, and yet still intellectually connected to a greater whole, which is what a lot of people think God is, for example. But then I can't remember where I was going with that. But what's your take on that, Morgana?
Well, the ego, if we want to come into that space, that's moving into a Freudian space, which I'm not quite as fluent in. But yeah, the idea that it's, become this thing that you say, oh, you have such a big ego if you like yourself or whatever, like that's such a misrepresentation of the idea. But it's like, yeah, you do want to get beyond it in a way. You do want to be able to access that space that is free from that story. And basically the ego is just that little dominating character, that sits at the front of our being and directs which way we should go. And it's not the truth. It's hanging out in that illusory world, which all of the religions and ancient cultures talk about, that there is this illusory world that we need to get beyond to access that true world. And that's, yeah, what we're trying to get to. And ideally, like, yeah, we do want to shred the ego in that sense and get to that great beyond, because that's where the truth is, that's where our soul is, that's where our like neutral expression exists beyond that polarity that we were talking about as well. But it's not a bad thing. It's, you can kind of think of it as like your protector in a way as well. It's, if we come back to like the Jungian concept, we come back to the idea that the things that we put into the shadow are things that we think are dangerous. So that ego or outward self wants to protect us. It's just like a kind caretaker that thinks it's got our best interests at heart. But ultimately, we want to get to the understanding that if we're caging off any part of ourselves, we're not expressing ourselves in our truth, and therefore we're not fulfilled. We can fall into states like depression and anxiety and all of these mental cages that make us feel like the world is against us, or like we don't have our own vitality. And that's a product of the ego trying to protect our true self from coming through.
I wanted to, oh, go.
There you go.
No, I wanted to just sort of bring into that. So it's almost like there is an aspect of the ego that is not ideal, because essentially we're trying to move ourselves beyond the ego. But then also in our recent studies of gene keys, Morgana, we have discovered that essentially he talks of this, that you get to that point when you end, when your life becomes like the whole, well, at least for me with a gene key 18 or a 17 or 18, 17, it's got a couple of them. But that key essentially is at the very end is when I will fully find, because I can't hold the two polarities that I meant to hold throughout life in order to spread or share my gifts with the world. It's only in the very end that I will, once I find that point where I'm assuming could be seen as essentially the ego dissolving completely, that is when I will move from this plane, because that'll be my work here is done.
Yeah, well, they have the 3 levels within each of the keys. So they have the shadow aspect of it, which is the challenge state, when we're not allowing it to express itself in its natural full form. The next level, once we can get beyond the challenge shadow state, is the gift. And so we can access the gift of that sign or key. And then the third stage they call the city. And that's when you are basically in your divine expression and that level beyond it. But he spoke about, I was listening to a podcast with the creator of it, and he was saying, I think he was saying, it was what I took from it, that we don't want to attach to it. It is essentially like the framework of our, I guess if we want to use the other terms that we were using, like the ego, I see it like a sieve. It's like the sieve that the ego is. And so where the keys are is where the holes that our soul can shine through. So when we're not quite in alignment with our inner soul, our true self, then those things, the rays of the soul that want to filter through, are going to come out slightly altered, maybe not in their full form. And so we want to get to the space where we are allowing it to come through in its totality. And then that's when we're feeling lit up. That's when we're feeling transcendent. That's when we have that kind of experience of invincibility, or that state of eternal bliss. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. I'm just trying to think of how I can kind of, how to sort of view all of this in a really like more, I don't know, simple. Break it down so it makes sense to 5-year-old me. No, okay. So what I wanted to say, because I sort of missed that, had to drop Aqua away, but did you talk about the animus and animi in those 4 archetypal? Okay. So So what I wanted you to dive into more or to explain more was, okay, so from your perspective, the archetypal model that you use has the four parts, and you touched on the shadow, and you've touched now on the persona. Did we kind of get to an idea what was the persona? It wasn't the ego necessarily. The persona was more your personality.
Yeah.
So
well,
is that the
it's
yeah.
like the mask that you wear. So it's like the way that you present yourself in
So
the world.
astrologically, would we say this is our ascendant? Would be the persona in your perspective from that?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. All the first house stuff. That's the mask that you are perceived initially by when you interact with other people.
Okay. And then going into the next ones.
So then the shadow is the stuff that is basically in the unconscious, and in simple terms, that means it's just the stuff that you're not conscious of. It's all of the stuff that is really true to you, but for some reason you've cast it aside because it wasn't socially acceptable.
Can we jump into this then? So if you have been doing, say, shadow work, this stuff is now no longer unconscious. Is it therefore no longer your shadow? Does it kind of ascend?
Yeah. So once it's been brought into the consciousness, it's not the shadow, it's illuminated.
Where does it go in the four archetypal model that you're functioning from?
So once it's been illuminated, it becomes integrated as part of the self. So the self is basically the goal of all of this, and that is the individuated, to use Jung's terms, person. So once you have integrated the shadow and allow it to become a part of you, it's part of the self rather than the shadow. So we want to ultimately get to a state where the shadow is completely integrated, and it's not necessarily going to fit into the persona because maybe we don't want to show up in the world as parts of the shadow still, but we have to acknowledge that it is part of us. And so maybe it needs to have expression in some other way. Like I find just writing is my practice of allowing that to communicate itself. And then maybe you don't make a secret of having certain traits that people might be, I don't know, judging you for or whatever, and you can accept it and say, yeah, that's something that I have within me or whatever, and laugh about it, but not let it be a big burden that weighs you down that you feel like is the elephant in the room that you have to hide from. So yeah, it's not necessarily the personality, but it is part of the self that we accept.
So we accept and know that. Okay. And Matt, from the Carol and Miss perspective, when we have what you've kind of the archetypal the archetypes that we went through last week, does that happen too? That once that shadow has come out of the unconscious, that it is alchemized essentially?
That's exactly how it happens. It's just different words, essentially. I think, I don't know where I picked it up, but there was talking about the self. There's actually 3 cells, and that's the self that you think you are, which is, if you were to spell it, would be self in all small letters. Self with a capital S is more your soul self. And then there's the self with all caps, which is you being connected to all that is. I don't know if that's a Carolyn Miss model. I don't think it's a Jungian model. Doesn't sound Jungian-y. Maybe it's a Joseph Campbell. I got it from somewhere. I'm brain farting on where right now. But it's essentially integrating that into all, making the shadow a part of yourself, into accepting it, and also ultimately loving that part of yourself and letting that part of you shine the best you know how to. That's when it's properly integrated.
So you've just added 3 to the self. Sorry. So now we've got like a little self, a capital self, and a capital self.
So would the capital self be like the individuated self, the self that has not got any burdens that they're trying to keep buried in the shadow, those weights that they're carrying to try and present themselves in a particular way?
Yeah, it would be the total freedom of it all. Yeah.
Would that be going back into thought then? Or are we still human?
We're human, I think.
You could be
So can we
human.
get to that? Because that would be the city, right? If we're going to come bring in gene keys as well, like that would be us living out the bliss state of the city of the.
I feel like that's something, and I might be wrong here. I might just be putting a glass ceiling on it, but I feel like that's something that is beyond the human form, beyond what we can comprehend within this state or experience within this state. It would have to be something that was like it's transcendent in some way, I guess.
Okay, yeah, I saw that too, but then from what you said before, I kind of was thinking that maybe you had the idea that you could get to the city in our functioning human state.
Well, I feel like we can express it at that level, but I'm not sure if we can fully, like, I don't know, comprehend or stay there. I feel like a lot of this is like we get glimpses of it.
And so are you saying then we get glimpses of the capital self, or is the capital self functional and we are actually capable of being that? Matt?
Is that to me? Yeah. I think we are capable of that, but as Morgan said, that it's probably more that could be what we would,
glimmers of bliss.
Well, it would be what we would call the maybe 2% of the world, the Muhammads, the Krishnas, the avatars that are able to transcend all the shit of the ego and kind of have experiences of oneness with all that is. But then the capital SELF, sorry, the capital S small elf, would be the individuated self, who's someone who's in alignment with who they are at like the soul level and just follows their heart and their soul in whatever they do, regardless of the consequences.
So that would be like the middle state of the gene keys, the gift state, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's nice to be able to put all these frameworks into a kind of neater.
Just tying it all together.
Can you go into, so what was the animus and the NMI?
So the anima and animus. The anima is the female soul within the male body, and the animus is the male soul within the female body. And so the idea of that is coming back to, again, like that idea of the polarity, but recognizing that there is kind of a polarity within us, which again ties to the Hermetic principles that everything has an equal opposite within it. So if you are in a female form, then you have a hidden male energy within you. If you're in a male form, you have a hidden female energy. And so it's about kind of exploring and expressing in different ways what that could be. So with that, like one of the main things that we can use to interact with the anima or animus within us is dreams, or even like looking at the relationships that we have in the real world. Some people function in a state that we see as like an animus or an anima. And so the reason that we're attracted to people often is because we see that they are a representation of that inner male or inner female that we have within us. And so there's like something within them that is magnetic because it's activating that hidden opposite within you.
That's really interesting, because when I was in Bali and I spoke with the Bali healer, I don't know if I shared this when we spoke about those my healing, but he shared for me that I am a masculine soul, and that and that Hampus is a feminine soul. So therefore that's how we meet together. And he also told me that it was my great-grandmother and my great-great-grandmother and his great-great-grandfather who chose us to meet. Anyway, it was quite interesting, because then I brought that to Matt, and Matt said, well, what was your perspective on that with the masculine and feminine? Wasn't it that you said that the female soul will generally become the male human? and vice versa? Did you share me, or did you just tell me that to make me feel good?
I think Morgana said it better. Whatever I said, or whatever I was trying to say, Morgana said it way better than I did, which was the female has the masculine energy, or I get them mixed up, the anima, animus.
So anima is
Yeah.
female, us
Yeah.
masculine.
So typically, yeah, what she said. She said.
What she said.
So essentially,
Okay.
then it would be connecting to the idea that your animus and his anima are what brought you together.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, interesting. And then if we look at the we were looking at the astrology right now, and where my where my signs met, like where was the majority of signs. Sorry, we're gonna anyway. And what I did see, actually, what did you say? Was it air and water were the most feminine?
Air and fire are masculine.
Air and fire are masculine.
Water and earth are feminine. So if you have a predominance of air and fire in your chart, then it comes forth as a masculine energy. If you have a predominance of earth and water, it comes forth as feminine. But then, like, you have to be careful about how you attach that feminine and masculine, because that's not just talking about like the gender roles. And maybe the Bali healer was just using that as a term as well, because they just come down to like the passive and active, or the the different poles within. If you think about the left side and the right side of your body, so the left side of the heart is where the energy flows in passively, the right side is where it pumps out. So it's that surrender and that balance. But then if you look at the male and female form, the female have that part that goes inwards, where the males have the part that comes outwards, and so it changes the way that we represent. And so again, like, words are just telling a story, and we've just built our own narrative around them.
Except women do have vaginas that go in, and
Yeah,
men have penises that
they do. But it's
go
like
out.
then we associate everything when we say feminine or masculine with the female or the physical male form, and it's not necessarily a man and a woman. It doesn't mean that you have a man inside you. Although,
have you not seen her? I knew I was
but it means that you have
transforming
like an activating, outward flowing force, where he maybe has a more inward, receptive soul.
Absolutely. And that is definitely the case. It was quite interesting though to hear, because I definitely have I am very robust and vital, and I see that, whereas there is like there is a definite gentleness and softness that I was trying to beat out of him, and now I realize that was probably the wrong way to go about it. Yes. Cool. So, all right. So then we're looking at this archetypal model, and we understand now that what we're trying to do is essentially alchemize the shadow, allow them to the surface so they are no longer in the unconscious, and then to live in a state of being this capital S, small elf state so that we can actually follow soul self. All right, the soul self.
I feel like that's kind of what that would be like. All of the small S, E, L, F, whatever. That's like the lowest expression, where you're just like ego self. Yeah. The soul self would be the capital S, and then spirit self would be like full S, where you're just like a walking Godhead.
Drop the mic. Cool.
Wow. Well, I feel like this has been fun. What do you think, Matt? Have you had a good time? Are you glad you answered the door?
I think technically you did. I don't know how to answer that in tech terms. I'm not the person to ask. But
you're definitely not a tech guy. But I'm glad we answered the door, and I'm glad you were here for us, Morgana, and we're excited. I'm sure there'll be plenty more time to bring you in, and to get a little bit more, to get deeper, I'd like to give you a moment to share. Is there what's going on in your world? Is there anything you want our listeners to know about that you're offering at this point in time?
Yeah, I've got a workshop coming up in a week and a couple of days on the autumn equinox, where we will be guiding everybody through a beautiful process that is kind of drawing on myth, storytelling, and somatic practices to connect with that dark feminine shadow self and allow you to hear the voices of it and bring it forwards in a really beautiful, empowered way. So yeah, if anybody is in Sydney and would like to come along to that, we're going to be tapping into the energies of autumn equinox, because that is all about the descent.
And how do people contact you, Morgana?
We will add it into we'll add all your links into the
thing.
notes. You know, those notes.
Perfect. You can find me on Instagram at Morgan Azali.
Beautiful. And I just wanted to think about just bringing that back. So is the aim of the autumn equinox practice to bring those shadows out of the darkness, and then ideally find ourselves reconnecting to the soul self? Is that kind of what the practice is going to help us do?
Yeah, so I could talk for a whole additional podcast on that. There's so much to it, but what we're kind of drawing on and connecting to, and it's also connected to this eclipse portal, just like synchronistically at this one particular year and juncture. It's really perfect because it's about that shifting of that Virgo sovereign self and allowing them to come through in that dark feminine way. But autumn equinox specifically is historically tied to the myth of Persephone, who's a really powerful dark feminine figure in Greek mythology. And so traditionally for thousands of years, the ancient Greeks would hold Eleusinian rites at the autumn equinox, where they would ritually enact the descent of Persephone. And basically the myth of that was that she got abducted into the underworld, became a queen there, and then had to come back and forth from Earth every 6 months. And so by following her lead and walking into the underworld, which is representative of walking into our own underworld, going into our own shadow, seeing what's in there and becoming queen of that space instead of a victim of the space, we are able to bring forth that light. And Persephone is, when she's on Earth, this glowing spring maiden. And so because she's able to go into the underworld and be queen of it rather than a victim of it, she brings forth that beautiful energy that we know as spring and summer. So we're holding this at the autumn equinox to basically walk the path of Persephone and follow nature's lead and go into the shadows and come out queen.
That sounds magical. And I guess you're going to have to do the or someone's going to have to step in and do the male version of that too, right? That has to exist as well, or?
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, we all have that feminine within us as well, the anima. So
are men also included? Can they
men
also
can definitely be included. Anybody that wants to do that work. As I said, it's not bound to a body specifically, the feminine and the masculine, but we are tapping into that space within that is connected to Lilith, connected to Persephone, connected to anything that is that Kundalini rising of sensual or rage, but in a positive pole. We're just working to transmute all of that stuff that is essentially ruling our lives and potentially having havoc in our lives, and allowing ourselves to let it have a safe space of expressing and moving. And once it has a voice, it isn't going to be destructive anymore. It's like Kali being confronted with Shiva and being sedated into being a happy little boundary setting goddess as opposed to a man killing demon. Yeah, it's good for everybody.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Morgana, for joining us. And amazing.
My pleasure.
Anything else, Matt?
Amazing. Check it out, people. My tip.
All right. Drop the mic.
Got the mic.
Peace.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Morgana.
You've been listening to The Wizard and the Priestess. Thanks for stopping by. Stay connected and be open.